in America, one of the most important modernist architects, Philip Johnson, was a member of the fascist party, went to Germany, tagged along with the Wehrmacht as they invaded Poland. This is all openly out there. Yeah. He was like an actual Nazi.
Wow.
And one of the interesting things about architecture, he came back to America and then apologized and said, okay, I'm not a Nazi anymore. But he then went on to have an amazing career.
You don't get a mulligan for that one.
And in most fields, like if you've been a Nazi or actively sought work for the Nazis, your career is done.
Yeah.
But architecture is about power.
All right, welcome to Who Versus. We have a very special guest, Justin Shubow. Justin, tell us who you are and what do you do?
Sure. So I run the National Civic Art Society. We're a nonprofit located in Washington, D.C. that promotes the classical tradition in public art and architecture. I'm also former chairman of the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, to which I was appointed by President Trump. Nice. That is the Aesthetic Review Board for Washington, D.C.
Love it.
And so when you, I think you got on our radar back in 2016, 17, 18, that time frame, at least on my radar, when we were talking about the beautiful buildings executive order. I was working on Capitol Hill at the time. I think you were already off the Hill. But that somehow cut through, and people who wouldn't otherwise care about art deeply cared about this thing in a way that I wasn't expecting. What is the beautiful buildings movement, and why should people care about that?
So back in 2020, at the end of his term, actually, Trump issued this executive order to promote beauty in our federal buildings. It was actually leaked in February of that year, and then that caused a huge firestorm. And unfortunately, a lot of the debate was about the leaked version, which was completely inchoate and never meant for the public, and much stronger than the one that was actually issued. So for instance, the leaked version required classical architecture for all federal buildings, but the order as issued, it was revolutionary. It reoriented federal architecture from ugly modernism to a beautiful classical and traditional design, requiring that these buildings be beautiful, uplifting, and nobly in the United States, and be appreciated by the general public as opposed to architectural elites. And the order was at its strongest regarding Washington, D.C., requiring that all new federal buildings here be classical. But across the country, it simply required that there be special regard for classical and traditional design. And one more thing, the order essentially made it impossible to build brutalist buildings and also deconstructivist ones.
Most importantly.
Yeah.
I've heard of brutalist. Maybe what is deconstructivist?
So deconstructivism became popular in the 1980s. It is sort of the architecture of chaos, disorder, fragmentation, pieces of buildings that are stuck together without seams, buildings that undermine the constitutive values of architecture, buildings that look like they're going to fall down. And deconstructivism has a lot of roots in literary theory. Deconstruction in general, the philosophy comes from Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault. I don't want to get too nerdy here, but Derrida, said architecture is the last fortress of metaphysics, and Derrida wished to undermine metaphysics and therefore wished to undermine architecture.
Tiffany, can you pull up a picture of deconstructivist architecture so I know what he's talking about?
I can fathom it.
You can fathom
in my
it.
Head.
So the first thing pushback you would get from somebody is who the heck are you to tell me what's beautiful? I love big gray buildings, and that to me is beautiful. What do you say to that?
Well, actually, my organization did a survey by the Harris Poll in 2020 of 2,000 American adults looking at their preferences in federal architecture. So it was a visual survey comparing photos of, similarly sized, scaled, colored, traditional versus modernist buildings. And the people surveyed were asked, which would you prefer for a federal building or U.S. courthouse? And 72% of the people surveyed preferred tradition. And there were widespread majorities across all demographic groups, gender, race, socioeconomic, and political party affiliation. I don't think the results are surprising, and I think a lot of even modernist architects would admit that. They know what ordinary people want, but many of them are arrogant and just don't care.
Yeah, that sounds right.
You mentioned it's the elites who like these sort of things. You know, we'll use the definition of elites of people in political power, the ultra wealthy sort of
And media elites.
and media elites. You know, these sort of unmoored internationalists who don't really call anywhere home. We'll use that as our definition. Why do they like brutalist, gross architecture? Like, what is it about living that lifestyle that causes you to hate the kind of architecture and the things we've been aspiring to for literally thousands of years? Like, even the pyramids, as simple as they are, there's a simple beauty there, you know, given the technology. Symmetry, given the technologies that they had at the time, the Sphinx, all that. Like, why do these people like that? Why are they rejecting what everybody else loves?
Well, that's a huge question. Part of it, and you know, this is also reflected in modern art, is I think for some of them, there's this underlying belief that beauty is bourgeois. So it's not necessarily that they're disagreeing about what is beautiful, but that they think other criteria matter more. The strikingness of the form, the honesty of the materials. It's conceptual, their appreciation of some of these buildings. They also like when it comes to brutalism, how admittedly powerful the architecture is. They're getting a thrill from this this great threat that you get from some of these buildings that are overhanging you and look like they're, you know, kind of gonna crush you. The term from aesthetics is they are sublime. Not sublime in the sense of like being amazing, but sublime in that actually Edmund Burke, the great conservative thinker, wrote an entire book on the sublime. He was actually interested in aesthetics. The sublime is a sense of overwhelming fear or awe you can get from a building or from a storm, things like that. And for certain enthusiasts of brutalism, I think they're getting a thrill from it in the same way that some people like horror movies.
It seems like brutalism is like a shock and awe tactic of the state.
Yeah.
Imposing brutalist buildings, like how this one kind of, what is that? That's
HHS.
That's HHS, how it kind of angles out at you and is imposing. It's to intimidate you. Yeah. Free people should not accept that.
Yeah, and what's interesting is there are certain defenders of brutalism who openly admit this. So, for instance, Jonathan Meades, a BBC filmmaker, made this entire documentary defending brutalism, and he said it's sinister architecture representing a harsher time. That's his exact word, representing a harsher time with a harsher architecture, and that's why he likes it. So, again, we're not disagreeing about what the building is or its effect, but we're disagreeing about what we should value in a building. So there's another defender of brutalism who also, maybe not coincidentally, is a socialist or even a communist, and he called brutalism a brickbat in the public's face.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Right? So, again, we're not disagreeing about the effect of the building. We're disagreeing about, you know,
the
is
morality
it beautiful
of it.
or is it more about, you know, the impressiveness of the concept. So like these people would rather have a building that is unusual, that is in your face, rather than something that's, you know, beautiful but kind of boring.
You said they think brutalism is too, was it bourgeois?
Well, beauty is bourgeois.
Beauty is bourgeois. Is that because they think the average person can't appreciate a beautiful building, and so this is something they can appreciate? What do they mean by that?
I think it's more akin to the fact that, at least in the early days of modernism, they thought that they were the avant-garde in the sense that they were literally creating a better society, a utopian world, you know, pushing aside everything in the past, the ancien regime. They were drawn to extremist ideologies on the left or right, whether it's fascism and Nazism or communism. You know, there weren't any great classical liberal early modernist architects. And in a sense that they were rejecting bourgeois values. Like I said, like they were trying to make a better world. And you do see the same thing in modern art, you know, with Marcel Duchamp's famous, you know, urinal. that is a complete rejection of what people used to think of as something what is valuable in art. So yeah, the modernists, you know, if it's like if your grandma liked it, they don't like it. There is a kind of class issue going on here, and it's a way of also like asserting themselves, like we are better, we are different. So I do think that is part of it.
Yeah, they probably view beauty as a luxury and wasteful. Beauty is not like. Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to follow that thread too much.
And there are other terms that you would never hear in modernist architects use nowadays, which is like grandeur. Yeah. They're not even. They're not saying that a brutalist building has grandeur. No. They would never even dare say that because everyone knows that that's not true. They're just going to use other words.
So it's not that they think these buildings are beautiful. It's not that they have different taste.
Well, I'm saying
they're literally telling us, yeah, we know they're not beautiful. We know they're not attractive to look at. They have a political and social purpose that we're trying to shoehorn in on society.
Yeah, I don't want to say all architects are against beauty, but I think many are. They're just not interested in it. When you go to architecture school, you're not studying how to make something beautiful. You're taught all other stuff, a lot of it gobbledygook based in, weird philosophy and linguistics and all the stuff
critical
that really
race theory.
Well, that has nothing to do, with what ordinary people think and feel. And there is, it's been empirically shown through studies, this great design divide between architects and ordinary people. Yeah. Not only do architects evaluate buildings differently from ordinary people, they can't even predict how ordinary people will experience them.
Jeez.
And that is because they have been brainwashed in architecture school. The longer someone is in school, the more their tastes and preferences diverge. It is a kind of brainwashing.
I'm not surprised by that, actually. It's like Hollywood. It's like we talk about frequently is these movies. Now there's a natural overlay because of the Brutalist. We could bring that into it. But the movies are completely disconnected from what average or really any American wants to see. Yeah. So they're making movies for themselves. Architects are making buildings for themselves. Yeah. Not for anyone else.
We talked about this a couple weeks ago. All the movies that just won Oscars for Best Actor, Best Director, Best Movie. We watch a lot of movies. We hadn't seen one of them. And no one we know, no one I know has voted for whoever. And that's sort of a lame thing to say. But nobody's watching these movies.
It can be shown empirically because they're not box office, they're garbage.
Whereas you go to movies that won in the 90s for best movie, these are classics, right? Like what were some of them?
It was like Titanic,
Forrest Gump with Wolves, Forrest Gump, Gladiator,
commercial success and Academy success,
super artistic.
There is this old way of becoming cultured about art or architecture, which is the idea that you need to look and look and look until you have washed your eyeballs. And if you go on a grand tour, say of Europe, like people used to do, and you see all the great works of the Western tradition. You are training your mind. But if you look and look and look and are only showed modernist buildings in architecture school, that's also going to shape your taste. And also, like, you're being told by your professors, these are the great architects, these are the great buildings. And if you disagree, by the way, we're going to crush you.
Right.
Because
you're not going to pass the class.
The way architecture school works is you have to like come up with your own work. And then there are these crits where the professor can actually humiliate you in front of the classroom. It's not like you go to law school where you could be a conservative student and disagree with your professor, but still do well in the exams and then go on to get a nice.
The professor will still humiliate you, but
maybe in class, but the exam
not
is
on the exam.
The exam is the exam.
Yeah,
and it is not like that in architecture school whatsoever. And there is we're talking about politics. There is a kind of opposition to small c conservatism in a lot of architecture.
Yeah,
I mean that's part of the reason why Trump's executive order was so controversial, just because to even respect the past, to say we should build something similar to what the founding fathers envisioned and wanted to set as a standard for the country, well, that is conservative in a certain way. Not, I think, in a controversial or partisan way, but just to admit that there should be some kind of continuity. Maybe some things in the past were good or even better than what we're doing today. And there are certain people on the left who don't want to ever admit that.
James brought up the movie The Brutalist. We were talking about that earlier this week. You convinced me to go see it. So what did you think of it?
I did not convince you to go see it.
You were already convinced.
I warned you. I
You just
warned
gave me
you.
the push I needed.
Well, I mean, I saw it out of professional obligation because I knew for the rest of my life people are going to say, "Did you see the Brutalist?"
Sure, we'll go with that.
Right. My response to that movie is I felt brutalized.
Dude,
Yeah.
the first 20 minutes of that movie are dark.
I would have walked out after 1 hour if I didn't have to see it for my job.
Yeah.
It bothered me on so many levels. But as for the architecture, I think it completely misportrayed the experience of these emigres from Europe. I mean, supposedly it's loosely based on Marcel Breuer, this Hungarian Jewish architect who came to America. But in the movie, he is oppressed by the WASP establishment. He's a struggling artist, can't find any work. In reality, he and all these other emigres were immediately incredibly successful in the United States.
Yeah.
He got a job at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. Walter Gropius, Harvard's Graduate School of Design. Mies van der Rohe, IIT in Chicago.
Yeah.
It is the American dream. And the whole movie is contrary to that, and like talking about how bad America is and how hopeless it is and how people are not accepted in our society. I mean, I'm not here necessarily to talk about politics, but just to talk about how architects were received is the opposite of the way the movie is portrayed. One thing I did like about the movie in terms of the architecture is at the very end, I mean, well, just for people who haven't seen the movie, and I guess we're
should
just
definitely do spoilers.
giving tons of spoilers here.
Yeah.
Who cares?
The main building in the movie is, I guess it's kind of like a community center being constructed by this multimillionaire. And at the end of the movie, we learned that the inspiration for the building, which they say is brutalist in the movie, whether it's actually brutalist is a little bit more
So they don't
complicated.
even get that right.
But when we see the interiors, it's like really dark and oppressive. And then we learn at the end of the movie that his inspiration was his experience in a concentration camp.
Yeah, of course.
And so there I'm like, okay, I can get behind this.
Okay.
Right? The
Yeah,
idea
that's a good
of
point.
like the building is oppressive because of his experience of oppression. So again, we're not
makes sense.
disagreeing about brutalism. I don't think in reality brutalists were inspired by their historical trauma. And I also didn't like the fact that he was such a tortured artist. From my experience, great architects are extremely well put together, extremely disciplined and focused. They're not heroin junkies like
or Jackson Pollock alcoholics
like
or
in
something.
a movie. It can be like that in art and literature,
Yeah.
but to be an architect, trust me, you cannot get away with that.
You're an engineer in some respects, right? Like the building has to stand. It can't collapse on itself. Right.
Yeah, and you're working with a whole team. It's not just you're not building this building on your own. So there was a lot, and from what I understand, a lot of architects dislike the movie as well. But I'm sorry that you had to sit through all 3 hours of it.
Let me
It's
ask
a
you.
3-hour movie, by the way. 3 hours and 20 minutes.
I'm out.
With an intermission.
Totally out on that. What is your favorite movie with an architect or about architecture or an architect? And there is a right answer I have in mind. Who's your favorite Hollywood portrayal of an architect?
This is a funny answer. Sleepless in Seattle.
Okay.
Wow. Never seen it.
The correct answer is Death Wish. So Paul Kersey is an architect who in New York, and his family gets slaughtered, and then he starts shooting pumps.
Well, this
That has nothing to do with architecture.
Well, no,
though.
it's a job that is sometimes used in movies and TV because it sounds interesting.
Yeah.
In Seinfeld, there was an episode where George pretended to be an architect.
Was that Art Vandelay?
Maybe that's what it was.
He uses it for everything, though. Yeah.
But it's like,
Marine biologist.
you with architects, you think, that's going to be popular with women because it's like artistic, but it's also engineering.
Yeah.
And you're a creator. Just one thing about like psychological influences on architecture. I mean, I was saying I don't think that concentration camp influenced modernist architecture, but some people have speculated that brutalism is sublimated fear of nuclear war. That if you look
Okay.
at some of these enormous
Okay.
buildings, like in Washington, like HUD headquarters or the HHS, these buildings, it looks like only a direct nuclear strike could take
take
them
it out.
down.
Well, they're steel reinforced concrete, right? They're bunkers. Is that the theory?
Yeah,
they're
and-
making bunkers,
And it's extremely expensive to take them down. I mean, the FBI building is going to be torn down. And
Thank you.
It's not that old. That building was
Yeah.
completed in the 1970s, but it's falling apart. But it's also going to cost maybe $1 billion just to tear it down. It's so
I wonder
so difficult.
inflation adjusted dollars, how much it costs to build versus tear down.
Well, the
What if it's like a 10 to 1 to
the
tear
government
down?
did an estimate about like is it more cost effective to repair it or tear it down and build an entire new FBI headquarters, and they figured out it's cheaper to just tear it down.
You know something in
Oh yeah, there you go. There's HUD.
yeah.
Yeah, oh, that's
Gross.
one of the worst.
You know what?
And that's by Marcel Breuer, by the way, the basis for the movie.
Okay.
I had never thought of them as nuclear bunkers, but I can never unsee this now. Like I'm just looking at like if it ever goes down, I'm going to HHS. You know, one thing I just say I liked about the Brutalist was, and again, like look, you're the movie critic. My top 5 favorite movies are some combination of Godfather and Rambo. You know what I mean? With Predator in there as well. So I'm not a movie critic, but one thing I did kind of like is the first scene where he creates the study library for Guy Pearce's character. I won't say I liked it, but it was simple. To me, it was like, you know, they do these concept cars every couple of years that they have no intention of ever putting on the road.
Yeah.
And they just have different streamlines and they look different things. That wasn't you know the room I'm talking about, right? It wasn't an ugly room. It was just simple.
But-
and then he went down, and look, I will never have it in my own house, but then he goes down this weird road where everything's made of, you know, rebar and concrete. If you could, first off, did you like sort of that, like that original architecture?
Well, again, I mean, here we are trying to describe a room on a podcast, but it's a library. I guess it's a big, huge circular room with a giant floor-to-ceiling window. And the bookshelves themselves, right,
Okay,
that's it
there
right
you
there.
go. There are these panels
That's a
that I
library.
think in theory are supposed to shut. And I would say one of the most beautiful things about being a library is seeing the books.
Right.
Seeing the books, and in this library here, all you see are the panels.
That's
and
not a
certainly
like what is that?
if they're closed, you know, you can't see the books at all. You don't even know you're in a library. And then even when they're open like that, it's still going to create a lot of shadow and make it hard to see the books. So again, it's like kind of like you were saying, like a concept car might be striking, but it's dysfunctional.
Right. Like
and
he maybe
also-
created the worst library in the history of the
and maybe
world.
less beautiful. I mean, you know, there are, you know, people talk about the most beautiful libraries in the world. Some of the greatest rooms in the world are libraries.
Tiffany, can you find what that room looked like before they remade it? Because it needed some work. It was a little run down, but it was
a library.
a nice room to be in. There was a beautiful desk and lots of books and interesting lighting.
Think about the Library of Congress, that main room at the Jefferson
Yes.
Building when you come. It's uplifting. Obviously, it has a dome on it.
Yeah. Or
It's beautiful.
The New York Public Library, Boston Public Library. These are some of the great public spaces in America. By contrast, in England, in the Birmingham Public Library is a brutalist. And then Prince Charles, who's actually been one of the main advocates for traditional architecture against
Really?
modernist architecture, he said about the Birmingham Library, it looks like a place for burning books, not for reading
Wrong.
them.
All right. He just
You kind of had it right there. That is right at the very top. That sort of looks like a red room. It's not a great shot of it, but you kind of get a sense of what it looked like. You know, it was of its time. Big heavy curtains, carpet, and on the side
that
were
also doesn't look like a library.
well, sort of his reading room, but at least
Okay.
it's got
Yeah.
some character to it, right? It feels comfortable. The other room, the way they recreate it, just has the bookshelves on the side, and then almost a odd sitting chair where you can't sit up and you can't lay down. You're sort of in that chair right there. I don't know how you'd read anything in there.
Right. It's kind of a chaise lounge.
Oh yeah.
And it's also so austere. There's just one chair. There's no table. There's
Yeah.
more than one person cannot use the room. I mean, psychologically, there's also that's not a comfortable space. There's no carpet.
Yeah.
It's going to be noisy.
Yeah, you're gonna.
So, the more you think about it, I mean, the filmmakers are making their point about the contrast between the modernist style versus what they're trying to show as like a dowdy, pre-war architecture. But, in that photo right there, once you see the panels are closed, you don't even know that it's a library, and you don't see the beauty of the books.
One of the things we like to do on the show is fix movies. So if you were to fix this movie, you have to keep the same basic plot of the movie, right? Like,
well,
he's still a brutalist architect. What would you do to fix the movie so that it is more in line with
does
what
he have to keep him as a brutalist architect? Can he just be
Well,
another architect?
what would happen in the movie? I mean, if you're going to follow Marcel Breuer's life, well, actually, first he went to England for a couple years, and then boom, he takes the boat to America, gets this plum position at Harvard, which was like the leading architecture school of its time.
How did he do that? How was he? He must have had a connection.
So
must have known people.
So the head of the school was Walter Gropius, this very important German architect who led the Bauhaus, which was the most important architecture school in Germany, and really the main source of modernism in continental Europe. Gropius, and I'll say something interesting about him in a second, he became dean of Harvard and then brought on, people like Marcel Breuer. Gropius, interestingly, this movie and a lot of the modernist myths in general try to portray these early modernist architects as being oppressed by the Nazis. And that's why they had to flee to other countries, including America. In fact, Walter Gropius actively sought work from the Nazi regime.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Wow.
And you can even see renderings of a building that have banners flying swastikas. Likewise, Mies van der Rohe, one of the other most seminal modernist architects, actively sought work from the Nazis and signed a letter Heil Hitler. So they were not,
Was Mies van der Rohe Jewish?
No.
No, he's
Okay.
not.
No, I don't know of
But
any.
he was
any-
an emigre from Europe to here.
Yeah, no, but he went to Chicago and then had a stellar career.
IIT. He did the Farnsworth House.
It's the American dream. But so
wrote Heil Hitler.
these guys are like actively seeking work from the Nazis, and then even some of the former Bauhaus students went to work for the Nazis. I think the gates at Auschwitz are actually in a Bauhaus font.
Oh my
Gosh.
So it's much more complicated than people are told. And then in America, one of the most important modernist architects, Philip Johnson, was a member of the fascist party, went to Germany, tagged along with the Wehrmacht as they invaded Poland. This is all openly
degenerate.
out there.
Yeah.
He was like an actual Nazi.
Wow.
And one of the interesting things about architecture, he came back to America and then apologized and said, okay, I'm not a Nazi anymore. But he then went on to have an amazing
Sorry,
career.
You don't get a mulligan for that one.
And in most fields, like if you've been a Nazi or actively sought work from the
kinda
Nazis,
done.
your career's done.
Yeah.
But architecture is about power. It's about
Okay.
power. And Nietzsche talked about the will to power in architecture. And it didn't stop Philip Johnson. It didn't stop me. And Mies van der Rohe and Walter Gropius, they designed important federal buildings. They're getting work from the U.S. government. They're like, okay, fine, the Nazis won't give us the work, but the feds will.
Yeah.
It's a very weird part of history.
See, that's an actual interesting story.
What do you I did not know any of this. Why
Well,
do you think
they'll
that
do
is?
that for
I mean, we use Nazis or ex-Nazis for the space program.
Mm-hmm.
They got federal contracts, or at least Nazi sympathizers or with active ties got federal contracts to build buildings. IIT, Mies van der Rohe, as you noted. That's state, but
Yeah.
And also something really weird. So Johnson, after the war, designed a synagogue in New York, sort of as his, recompense. And the synagogue,
Is it
I'm not
nice?
kidding you, looks like a pillbox bunker.
what?
Maybe you can find the entrance, which I think,
How is that a synagogue?
looks like a pillbox.
It looks like a pillbox or like an agricultural building, maybe.
Look, I grew up
With
in
a
South
silo?
Florida, around a lot of synagogues in my area because it was just Catholics and Jews where I grew up. I've seen enough synagogues. That's like nothing I've seen before. They don't look like that.
Yeah. But being a Nazi doesn't really hurt you in architecture.
Or rocketry. We're willing to accept. Wow, nothing about that lets me think that's a place of
It
worship.
looks like the entrance to a gas chamber.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, and one more major architect that I
geez,
didn't
yeah.
mention is a Swiss French important seminal modernist architect called Le Corbusier. He was also a fascist. And
what is it about fascism? I guess just time and place where they grew up. Like you are part of the environment when you came up, or
no, they like the idea
power.
of like a revolution in the social order. And like fascism was like this exciting way of doing that.
Yeah.
are these guys going back to college, universities? These guys are all studied today, right? If I go to
they are
architecture
not
school-
just study; they're the great heroes, the great heroes of modern art.
What is the antidote to this? I mean, the executive order is one of them, but like, who is anti this? Who are we versus?
Well,
Who are you- that's a good point. Who are we versus?
Well, actually, if you see that there's a photo that has a bunch of towers on the top left.
Mm-hmm.
So this is Le Corbusier's plan for Paris.
Oh my god.
He wanted to demolish most of the historic city.
Sure.
And at the bottom right, you can see, well, I'm not sure if you can see where Notre Dame is, but basically he wanted to put what looks like public housing towers and literally destroy Paris. That's why, and that's a computer rendering of what it would have looked like
God.
if he had succeeded it. And there you can see the Cathedral of Notre Dame relative scale.
It would have been, overshadowed.
He's
by
been
these
called
tenements.
the Pol Pot of architecture.
That sounds right.
Right, wanting to start from the year zero, eliminate everything that exists, and rebuild. I mean, it's not heroic; it's villainous.
Yeah, correct.
We were just I was watching some of the conclave when they were picking the new pope. Obviously they're in the Sistine Chapel. If you go to architecture school today and art school today, are you even studying that? Is that even a part of your
Do you go
curriculum?
to Florence? Do you?
No, architecture schools today almost exclusively teach modernism. Like maybe in an architectural history class, you'll learn about things prior to World War I, but at the vast majority of schools, like that's just not what you study. Architects really don't learn how to draw by hand. They don't do shadow studies. You're asking about what is an antidote. There is at least one exception, which is Notre Dame's architecture school.
Okay.
Actually teaches classical architecture. And similarly here in Washington, Catholic University is increasingly teaching classicism. So there are a couple of exceptions, but by and large, it's not even like, oh, well, there is 20% classical architecture taught. It's like essentially zero.
Yeah.
And people who disagree with modernism are not even welcome to give a talk at the school. It's completely verboten, and it's also very aggressive. If you critique modernism, they'll come down on you like a ton of bricks.
Wow.
And that's why I'm an outsider. I'm not a trained architect. I'm unafraid to take arrows if people disagree with me. But if you're an architect and want to disagree even mildly, they will try to crush you. And an example of this, there was a book published in the late 70s called Morality in Architecture, which was a critique of modernist ideology about how it's based on this view of an inevitable progress in history coming. And if now we can get really philosophical, based in the philosophy of this 19th century German named Hegel, this idea that there is this capital H history, that it's unfolding, there is this necessity, and the modernists think that they're kind of just like part of that building in the spirit of the age. And this book critiqued all of that, and this guy was just this mild-mannered professor in England, but they attacked him as if, the modernist establishment attacked him as if he were the devil.
Yeah.
But do they still control all the levers of power?
Oh, for sure.
Well, they control all the schools.
I guess what I'm saying is, like, even nowadays in our political discussion, you have people who are ascendant who, in just to say in politics, who have no formal training in history or political theory or being journalists, and yet they have huge followings and they can make critiques of the establishment and the way things are, and they can punch through because of things like social media. Kind of feel like if you're going to be a critic of brutalist architecture and modernism, now's one of the best times to be doing it, because you don't have to go through the art schools, you don't have to go through the corporate news networks. Like,
Yep, that's absolutely true. And the internet is extremely helpful for this because you can publish photos cheaply. I mean, the zero cost and as many as you want. I mean, historically, if you wanted to learn about architecture, you'd have to go to the library and pull out this book and then pull out that book. It would take forever.
And travel and see these places.
And now there are some really influential accounts on Twitter, for instance, all about attacking modernist architecture and promoting classical architecture. And they have huge followings. So there's one guy, he used to be called Culture Critic. I think he renamed himself as the Culturalist. You know, he has 1 million followers.
Yeah.
And if you look, some very influential people follow him too, not just people
Phil.
like not just like people like you and me, but like people in positions of power follow him.
Yeah.
And yes, like social media has been incredibly useful in hopefully turning the cultural tide.
We were, do you have something? No. We were talking about this the other day. For whatever reason, again, not a historian, not a no background in art. I just like Art Deco.
Yeah.
What's like to me? That's the most
Psychoanalyze him. Why do you like that?
I've always seen it as like the most American art form.
Yeah.
But you were telling me the other day it's really not. It has its roots in Europe, right?
Well, I mean,
Interwar
the
period
term
of
Art
Europe?
Deco comes from a specific exhibition in France in the 1930s. I think it was like Art Deco, Art Décoratif, to use my terrible French. But then it was really picked up in America in, our skyscrapers like the Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building, and there's some other great Art Deco buildings throughout the country. Art Deco was the last of the classical styles, I would say. So it's still rooted in tradition, but it also showed the creativity that is possible within that tradition. It incorporated technology, modern machinery. So, for instance, the General Electric building in New York has like lightning bolts on it. And it also did interesting things like incorporate art from the Western Hemisphere, like Aztec and Mayan motifs, which, I mean, just like a very cool thing to do and innovative. And so you look at the Chrysler Building, I mean, it's so inspiring and it just screams Gotham, right?
Yeah. Well
and that's what people think of, I think, when they think of New York, not, a generic box skyscraper that has no artistry whatsoever.
I'm kind of a Tolkien nerd, and I saw something that said Art Deco looks like it was created by dwarves, and Art Nouveau is created by elves. And I was like, they had these pictures. I was like, oh yeah, like an elf architecture would be Art Nouveau, Art Deco would be dwarves. Like it kind of made sense to a simpleton like me. That's apropos of nothing. So here's a going a different direction. What American city?
You're right.
2-part question. Art Nouveau. Well, you got to get the branches and all the weird. Yeah. There you go.
That's Gaudi. I wouldn't. I mean, it gets more complicated. I don't know if I'd call that it's Art Nouveau, but it's related. These organic forms.
What American city has the best architecture? And like all my questions, there's a correct answer. I'm like John McLaughlin in that way. I ask questions. That's a dated reference that we all get. Tiffany does not.
I mean, I do think probably the most beautiful city, at least at in its core, is Washington, D.C.
Okay.
Maybe not the city, all throughout. It's not like going to Paris.
You and I got to visit Southeast.
Where it's block after block after block
East.
of beauty.
Yeah.
But, the monumental core with the National Mall, the Capitol. I mean, we should not take for granted just how amazing Washington, D.C. is.
Yeah.
There are plenty of other world capitals that are not nearly as nice. I don't know if I'm going to name any. Okay, fine. Look up the new Scottish Parliament building or the new Welsh Parliament building, and it shows you what honestly United States would have constructed today if we were starting over.
What? That can't be it.
No, that is the Scottish Parliament building.
I don't.
William Wallace would
You don't
not
even
approve.
know what you're looking at.
I can't tell.
You can't tell it's a civic building.
So the correct answer to that question was Chicago, but that's all right.
But Art Deco in Chicago.
You can't beat the National Mall.
Yeah.
Right.
You can't.
Were you involved in that fight a couple years ago when they tried to make a statue of Eisenhower?
That's actually what really got my start.
That
in
cut
this-
your
in
teeth.
this field.
Where he's barefoot in overalls
So
in
yeah.
Kansas.
So what's the background of that, and then what was the fight?
So
Who were you versus?
In that case, so there was a proposed design for a National Eisenhower Memorial, and the architect is Frank Gehry, who is arguably the most famous living architect today. He's, a lot of people will call him a so-called starchitect. These architects that are celebrities.
Yeah.
And the original design, and this is something my organization and I exposed, the original design was going to depict Eisenhower only as a life-size barefoot boy seated on a plank, a kind of Tom Sawyer image, cutting a great man down to size. Of course, no one would recognize him as a little boy. And by contrast, behind him is this gargantuan steel screen, a so-called tapestry. Originally, it was going to portray the Kansas landscape, and the tapestry is so big that it's bigger than the Hollywood sign in Los Angeles. They give you a sense of just how big it is. And so it was topsy-turvy in its scale and symbolism, and we started this whole huge fight to stop it. Ultimately, the Eisenhower family came out against it in full force, and Gehry was forced to make certain changes. It's a sad story. Ultimately, the memorial did get built. The Eisenhower family caved to pressure. There was a backroom deal brokered by former Secretary of State James Baker. And so now we can see images of what it looks like today. The tapestry, which is supposed to be the main feature, is completely illegible. Now it's supposed to depict Normandy Beach today at peacetime.
What?
Really, it's a bunch of scribble scrabble. It looks like a doodle by Frank Gehry. At night, you can see a little bit about a little of what is depicted. But again, you tell me,
what's the part we don't see
That
during the
stuff
day?
in the back.
That screen.
What that giant thing there is part of the
That's part of the memorial. So if you look at another photo, you can see how it's just a wire mesh. Yeah. So we did vastly improve the design. There were two huge pieces that were removed, each as big as a basketball court, that would have blocked views to and from the Capitol. And it's very sad. This memorial, I think, cost $180 million, and no one ever goes there.
I've never been here.
It's just south of the Air and Space Museum.
Okay.
So I can walk there
and
easily.
north of the Department of Education. Nobody goes there.
What a shame.
Yeah, that shows you.
Oh my gosh.
And even Gary's official biographer, Paul Goldberger, who is a big fan, and the book even calls Gehry Frank throughout. That's a very strange biography to use the person's first name. But even in that book, he writes that Gehry was shocked that more of his friends didn't come out in support of the design. And then Goldberger writes, well, even Babe Ruth struck out sometimes.
Wow. So it's pretty universally recognized.
I have not seen one positive review of the memorial.
Those look like smokestacks for some sort of plant.
Yeah, my one of my jokes is it looks like an incomplete highway overpass. Some kind of joke about Eisenhower creating the interstate. And then you can see there are also these freestanding pillars. I mean, I'm not saying that's what Gehry was thinking, or there are missile silos. There are all sorts of ways of interpreting them. But this is sort of a deconstructivist design in the sense of look at how the screen is just kind of glued to the pillars. There's no seam. There's no connection.
Harmony.
It's just a bunch of things that have been thrown together, which is often found in Gary's architecture.
I got to look at some of this other guy.
Some
of Gary's other stuff.
Is there
Frank's?
Let's just talk
We're first
about
name.
Frank.
Just talking Frank.
Is there anybody now doing great architecture in the present day?
Sure.
Like where would we look at for new buildings, new architecture, new homes?
My neighbor across the street did the Gaylord. It's terrible. He was the head architect.
guy?
I hope he watches this. Jeff.
Look at that. That building looks like it's melting, for goodness
Well,
sake.
yeah, show that one, and then I'll tell you something.
That's discordant, right?
No, did you see the one that looks
The
like
one
it's
that's
all crumpled?
Oh, this one.
Yeah. So this is literally
How
an
do you live in
institute
that?
for brain health.
Well, I mean, it does kind of look like
a little on the nose.
disturbed brain.
And this
but-
is an example of deconstructivism. You see how it looks crushed or destroyed. disorienting. And in fact, the interior is so disorienting for the patients that they have had problems.
Are there pictures of the interior?
Yeah, you could Google.
I mean, that'll make
interior.
you insane.
I'm looking at it. It's
I'm kind of
making me
getting
feel.
insane.
Yeah.
I mean, I now have
I'm
mental
getting real
health
hot.
issues.
This is like Eastern.
It's the Lou Ruvo Institute for Brain Health.
LOU.
RUVO. And maybe just look up interior.
Oh my gosh. That's like that's actually evil what they're doing. Like they're trying to hurt people with that.
Crazy.
They're trying to hurt people.
You know, I don't need you to comment on this, but this just makes me think that there's demons involved. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, it's
like
demonic.
a person who has love in his heart and wants to
Help
help people doesn't do this.
does not make that.
Doesn't do this.
Well, I'm not going to ascribe bad intent for that building, but Gary, for his own house, took this quaint, I think it was like a colonial house in Santa Monica, and then like exploded it with chain link fence, plywood, and it kind of looks like a Cubist haunted house. And then in a very traditional neighborhood, we can also maybe find a photo of his own house. But when when people complained about it, like, how could you do this? And he said, or you can look at the top left. That's the house.
Like corrugated steel.
And then he said, well, but look at the boat in your driveway. Look at the chain link fence in your house. So in other words, he's like recognizing the ugliness in the neighborhood and replicating or emphasizing it as opposed to ameliorating in it. So arguably there almost was a passive aggressive intent in his house design.
That's disgusting. Frank Gehry. I'm looking him up.
Phil, you can't even talk. You're so
Oh,
shy.
you know what?
man.
He's Canadian American.
Yeah.
That
Oh,
could be
boy.
part of the problem.
That's a problem. They walk among us. We can't even tell.
I know.
But
SS
here, look
uniforms.
up Frank Gehry Panama.
I'm a simple man of simple
And
questions.
look at this one.
What?
What?
It's
This looks like a thing out of Toy Story. or
no,
something.
you know what it really looks like? It looks like houses after a hurricane.
Yeah.
Where they're piled on top
Yeah.
of each other. And like this, I'm not exaggerating, where in
that a home?
it's a museum.
Museum.
In deconstructivism, there is a sense of violence that is completely new to architecture. Like you'll find buildings that look like tornadoes, that look like they've been destroyed. And this is what I don't think it's controversial to say that I think ideal buildings should look solid and secure and make us feel protected from the elements. And, we have intuitive notions of physics and of safety. And these kind of architects are wishing to undermine all of that.
Subversive. It's all subversive. Who's the best architect right now? Who's your favorite architect of all time? Number one. Who's your favorite American architect?
Man, these are super hard questions. The greatest architect of all time. I mean, look, I'll answer it this way. Probably no, I'm not even going to answer these questions.
Wow.
Christopher Wren.
I don't want to be put on. I don't want to be put on the spot right now.
Who do you-
But I will, as an example of what a new good federal courthouse
That's a fine question.
can look like is the Tuscaloosa Federal Building and Courthouse, if you could look that up. So this is a rare exception of a new classical courthouse.
Oh, beautiful.
And
Looks
the
like Supreme
only
Court.
reason this exists, you can see that it's a Greek revival design.
Yeah.
The only reason this exists is because Senator Shelby of Alabama, who was chairman of the Appropriations Committee, he told GSA, the agency that oversees federal buildings, I want classical courthouses in my state. And even he had to fight. I spoke to the chief judge who oversaw this construction, and he said that originally GSA wanted to give them a glass box. And then Shelby had a fight saying, no, I want something that looks
for
like a
Shelby.
courthouse.
If there's one man in Congress who could make that happen and has the stroke to do it
was
Senator
Dick
Shelby.
Shelby.
So it's also bizarre. There have been instances where the judges themselves have asked for a classical courthouse. and then GSA foists a modernist one on them. So it's like the judicial versus the executive branch, and the executive bureaucrats win.
Yeah,
and this is something that Trump was entirely fighting. I mean, so there are these 1962 guiding principles for federal architecture that GSA treats as holy writ. They're not official or anything. They were never instituted in legislation or an executive order, but they were drafted by Daniel Patrick Moynihan when he was like a 30-year-old staffer at the Labor Department. And as you know, he later went on to become a very famous senator from New York. Yes. And it was a report on federal office space. And he put in this one page that these, he called it the guiding principles. And one of them that's very important is it says, design shall flow from the architectural profession to the government and not vice versa. So it was putting the private sector in charge. It's like the government saying to the contractor, you tell us what we should be doing. And that's like reversal, that abdication of authority exists to this day.
All right, that needs to be rooted out, root and stem.
Assuming that courthouse is built well, and I have no reason to believe it's not, that'll last for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
And it'll be a monument to Dick Shelby, but also
there's many of them.
Well, they literally after he left Congress, they literally put his name on the building.
Yeah.
They inscribed
many
it.
such cases.
Yeah.
A lot of buildings in that state with his name on it.
these classical buildings last hundreds if not thousands of years. I mean, the US Capitol is a 200-year-old building and it's working just fine. The FBI building from the 1970s, the Brutalist building, is falling down. Yeah. Those buildings age very badly. And so,
why is that? I thought their whole premise was this is concrete and stone, and it's gonna last forever.
Because they have the rebar in them, it deteriorates over time. It's not. I mean, the Romans too used concrete. Like the Pantheon is a concrete building, but they didn't have this internal steel structure, and also their concrete was different in certain ways. But these concrete brutalist buildings, especially in wet climates with road salt, the structural integrity becomes compromised. So the HUD headquarters by Marcel Breuer, who we've been talking about, that requires $500 million in must-do repairs. We're not even talking about bringing it up to Class A office space. And it's just falling apart. And HUD itself recently said that they want to leave the building. And I think there's a very good chance it's going to be torn down. Another brutalist building in Washington that requires $500 million in repairs is also the Forrestal building.
Oh, yeah. It's
headquarters of the Department of Energy. And that building is not even by a named architect. A lot of people hate it. It divides the National Mall from the southwest quadrant, and it bridges the street. Like behind, in the distance is the Smithsonian Castle, which you can't even see.
Right.
I actually published recently an op-ed calling for demolishing this building, and I do think that this could be one of the great accomplishments of Trump's administration.
No kidding.
That there is a lot of interest in redeveloping what's called the Southwest Federal Center. Putting in, that building is so big you could put 2 new Smithsonian museums there instead of like cramming them on to the National Mall, which the Smithsonian wants to do.
Ugh.
And also then you can even extend the mall southward at that point from the Smithsonian Castle and then have mixed use development to actually have people living in that part of the city to give it some life. And the DC government too wants to redevelop this area. These buildings a lot of them are very empty. They're aging badly. And it's prime real estate. It's right next to the National Mall.
The water's not far.
So that I hope will be a priority.
Do you dabble in urban planning at all? Is that part of?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's part of Washington, D.C.
It's kind of hand in glove.
Washington is the creation of 2 great urban plans. Yeah. The 1793 L'Enfant Plan, which set up the general scheme for the city, based symbolically on the Capitol, on the high point, Jenkins Hill, and then the White House on a lower hill, symbolically separating the branches of government and creating this right angle with Pennsylvania Avenue connecting the Capitol to the White House. And then you have these grand vistas and boulevards. And the L'Enfant Plan, I mean, it was ridiculously ambitious for 1793. I mean, there was nobody living here. Why would you want to preserve all this space, have a national mall? Because there's like all these fields, but he was, wanting to build a new Rome. And the founders really were thinking about a new Rome. Even the word capital, why is it spelled with an O instead of an A?
It's only
that's named after the Capitolium Hill in Rome.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
And so there's all this like kind of Roman influence or these huge ambitions. But Washington didn't really develop much until like late into the 19th century. Nobody lived here. And then at the turn of at the beginning of in the late 1800s, there was widespread agreement that something needs to be done in Washington. The National Mall was completely grown over with trees. You wouldn't even recognize it. There was a huge train station just to the west of the Capitol building. And they came up with a new plan for the city, the so-called McMillan Plan, which was there you can see just to the west of the Capitol, you can see there's kind of something with a little point right there. That's actually a huge building, a huge train station. And you can see the mall itself was all grown over. And the Washington Monument in that image you can see is also incomplete.
Yeah.
But
that's why it's two different colors. Which
Senator McMillan, who was extremely influential, created a Senate Park Commission to come up with a new plan for Washington. And it was a dream team of all the greatest designers of the day. And they came up with, what is now called the McMillan Plan that came out in 1902 that built the monumental core as we know it. It built the National Mall, extending it all the way to the Lincoln Memorial. It was the proposed, because then the mall used to end just to the west of the Washington Monument. That was all like water and swamp. And the rest of it's actually landfill. And they completely thought about rebuilding the center of the city. And I think it's fair to say that the National Mall is one of the great spaces in America. It's a gathering place. It makes you feel like Washington is an eternal republic.
Yeah.
Right. Even though the mall is only 100 years old, 120 years old, it feels like it's been there forever and will be there forever. And that was an achievement of this plan, because the plan was not just about classical urban planning, but also classical architecture.
There's a good shot of the Lincoln Memorial.
Yeah.
Swamps and ponds inside.
And so that's where Washington's classical identity really comes from, is the McMillan Plan. And I do think what we need is a new plan for the next 100 years.
Yeah.
And I would love there to be a new, you could call it McMillan 2.0.
Who are the great men?
Administration.
Like you've described, like Richard Shelby. He is a great man just because he had the power of the purse forever, right? Mm-hmm. He demanded classical. You talked about Senator McMillan. Who are the great men that can get this done? Obviously Donald Trump, right? But where is the next generation of people that rise up and say, like, hey, we want beautiful things? Is there anyone on the horizon?
Well, in government, obviously, there's President Trump with his executive order. And I didn't mention, but almost immediately after getting elected, Biden rescinded the order.
Yep.
But day one of the new term, Trump issued a memorandum planting the flags, saying that federal architecture is going to be important. Yeah. And I know there's going to be an executive order issued, soon, a new executive order. So there is Trump himself, a master builder. But, in the last Congress, there was legislation introduced to essentially codify Trump's vision. And the lead sponsor in the House was Jim Banks of Indiana, who is now a senator. And the lead in the Senate was Marco Rubio. And actually one of the co-sponsors was J.D. Vance, and there were a lot of other people. Yeah. So there is a lot of interest on Capitol Hill as well in these issues. And so I'm very optimistic that big things are going to happen.
I can't think of a chairman of a committee or a U.S. senator that's an architect. Are there any that I'm missing? There's got to be a congressman
There's only been one that I've ever known. I think his name is Richard Sweat. He's no longer.
Yeah, Dick Sweat. He's from New Hampshire.
Yeah, and he's no longer in Congress. Yeah. But
unfortunate name.
Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who tried to bake in modernism in 1962. He, to his credit, he was extremely knowledgeable about architecture and later became a devotee of classical architecture and historic preservation. He was very proud of getting the Reagan building constructed, which has a vaguely classical design on the exterior. And so he certainly knew a lot. He gave some great speeches about architecture. And he used to quote Thomas Jefferson saying that, design and political activity are inherently related. He got it.
Yeah.
A lot of great statesmen throughout history have understood the power of architecture for the body politic.
I'm going to put you on the spot. Everybody knows you don't like brutalism. That's why you're here. If you had to pick one that approaches something nice to look at, what would it be?
Well, some people claim, and I'll grant it for these purposes, that the platforms in the DC Metro are brutalist. You know how there's that coffered ceiling?
Yes.
And
Yeah, we're looking at it earlier.
Yeah.
And so,
Okay, yeah.
Is that brutalist? Is it not brutalist? Certainly other parts of the station are brutalist, and I don't think actually anybody likes those. But, this is actually a ripoff of an 18th century design by a French architect named Boulet. And if you want to look that up, Boulee library, look that up.
It's
And so that's a
Total
classical
ripoff.
that's a classical design.
Looks like a train station.
So it's sort of like, yes, it's concrete and it's, massively repetitive. At the same time, it's coffered and has classical influence. So I think the DC Metro stations are too dark, actually. I think
They are very dark.
They're
It's a weird light in
They're
there,
underlit.
actually.
But,
Also
if you
dirty.
had to put me on the spot and say, have me say something positive about brutalism, I would say, okay, fine.
well, not even brutalism, but you would say if you're going to look at a good what it could be,
Right.
and not be offensive, it'd be the DC Metro.
Where the platforms are, not
Yeah.
when you're walking into the station, which it's often just like you'll see stains running down the walls, looks like abstract art. That I don't like at all. But
Or the fact that the escalators never work.
but they're look at that.
Cleveland Park?
Like, does anyone think that's great architecture?
No.
I mean,
There are the
Yeah.
purely utilitarian, right? It's like a parking garage.
Yeah.
What's funny about that movie is, in some way, they were obviously trying to make brutalist architects sort of heroic in some way for their struggles and achieving what they did. It made me hate it even more. Like, I knew I didn't like it because it doesn't look good. It made me more. I just disdained them more
Yeah.
because of what
Had
they
the
done.
opposite effect on
Right.
Well, it's funny, one more thing I should have mentioned when talking about how people perceive brutalist buildings. One of the worst is the Boston City Hall. This brutalist building kind of looks like a upside down Aztec, execution place.
Gosh, yeah.
And when it opened, Philip Johnson, that former Nazi architect I mentioned, he said, "I love it. It's so ugly."
Oh my God. Well, I mean, they're saying they don't even hide it.
Yeah.
But
That's like the architectural equivalent of the body positivity movement.
Right.
Right. It's like
There you go.
big at any.
Well,
like,
it's
beautiful
funny.
at any scale.
It's funny you should say that
Orwellian.
because a lot of fans of brutalism have tried rebranding the style. They call it heroic. It's heroic architecture, and what they mean is, these architects are trying to achieve big things, build a better world, and there is a kind of muscularity of these buildings, but it's like using power for negative means instead of positive means. And so I don't think buildings should be judged by their intent. I think they should be judged by their effect. And so it's not heroic. That's a villainous building.
Well said.
It's pretty good
perfect
place to end it.
Yeah.
Also, another movie. We're not going to talk about it, but on your recommendation, I saw Warfare. Incredible.
Is that architectural?
It's not architectural.
Oh, okay.
It's about a Navy SEAL platoon. It's the best war movie I've ever seen. You were right. You said you're going to go in there not knowing what to expect. You're going to come out saying it's the best war movie you've ever seen, potentially. It's the best. It's better than Black Hawk Down. It's better than Saving Private Ryan. Better than all of them. Better than Fury.
And I would
which is a lot
say
of fun.
you really need to see it in the theater.
Yeah, I got to see it in theater.
Especially for the sound design.
Yeah. IMAX.
Yeah.
Justin Shubow.
Thank you
you
so
very
much.
much.
Thanks for having
Appreciate
me.
it.
Thank you.